Well, welcome to episode 100 of the Finish Line podcast, where typically Kealan and Cody discuss the intersection of faith, generosity, and personal finance. But this is the shoe is on the other foot episode. Kealan and Cody, in a weak moment, agreed that Todd Harper and I, David Wills, we could flip the script and interview the two of them on this very special 100th episode. But first, everyone should know that this podcast, people learn about it word of mouth. And so we really encourage you to share this with your family, with your friends, even do a recommendation on the podcast thing. You need to spread the word of the Finish Line podcast. So Todd and I have both been on the Finish Line podcast in the past. And so my first question to you is, are you guys nervous? Because you've made about 99 other people pretty nervous. How are you feeling?
You know, if it was anybody else, I wouldn't be nervous, but you've got me a little nervous.
Yeah, I'm excited. This is going to be a lot of fun.
This is going to be a lot of fun. And, you know, there's often kind of like a little plug at the beginning of the podcast. So I want you guys to start off by giving us a plug for the Finish Line sprints. I've been through the thing online, and it's very interesting, and you guys just don't talk about that enough on the podcast. So I'm going to tee this up for you to share it. I've gone through the sprint and I wanted to buy the rental house, but I never could figure out how to do it. And you're going to have to go through it, listeners, if you want to know what I'm talking about, but you'll see. But tell us about the Finish Line sprint, the idea for it, and what your goal is with it.
Yeah, so the Finish Line sprint was actually one of the first things. It predated the podcast, and it really came out of this desire to figure out how to have a process for inviting people into setting financial finish lines. So this whole thing kicked off when Kealan invited me to set a financial finish line, although we did not know there was a word for it. There was a term for it. Other people have been doing this for a long, long, long time. It's not our idea. But Kealan had done that and invited me, and my wife and I agreed to also set a financial finish line. And we started talking about how could we share this with other people. And so the Finish Line sprint it was originally created as a small group curriculum that we imagined churches could use, Bible studies could use to really dive deep into what does Scripture say about wealth and generosity, and what does that mean for me? And then give you some practical tools on what to do with that once you've really collectively jumped into those. And so we learned that there are other curriculums like that available that have been around a long time. And we've been through a lot of those as well. What we've done more recently is broken that into modules so that it's not 8 weeks of an hour at a time. You don't have to progress through it in a linear sequence. You can just jump in right where it's relevant for you. And then we started to make some interactive activities like you were talking about. It's the game of life. It's a game, really, that is based on a parable, and it teaches you something about how you think about money. There's a lesson embedded within the activity. And then we created another game. And so that's something we just kind of work on all the time. And we're always trying to think of ideas on how to create engaging content other than the podcast.
Excellent. We'll say, though, David, you can get that rental house. If you give it another try, there's a way to do it. So keep trying.
Yeah, I think I was giving away too much money to get the rental house because I've listened to your podcast.
Yeah, you can't mess around with that. You got to go. Yeah. You got to go right for the gold.
David's just too generous. I mean,
I'm too generous. I felt guilty doing the Finish Line sprint and not being generous. And I thought, to get what I want, I need to be less generous, which is probably not a good sign of my current condition from a generosity standpoint anyway. I think the next thing we probably need to do, and you guys ask all your guests to do this, but maybe this happened on episode 1 or 2, but could you give us a little of y'all's background, including some spiritual portions of that? And also, if you could comment on the aspiring to the median that you used to use. So that's the last of the historical things, and then we're going to jump into some other questions.
Yeah, good question. I wasn't expecting that one to come up, but there's a cool story behind that too. So yeah, just a quick background. We did each do a personal interview episode in the first couple episodes. I don't remember exactly how much I covered then. Short background on my faith. We both grew up in the same Christian home. We're brothers. for anybody who hasn't figured that out in the last 100 episodes. But I'd say I really didn't understand my faith, definitely did not have it as a central part of my life until ninth grade. I had another older guy at my church who kind of became a mentor through pseudo-formal process at our church, which was pretty impactful for me. And it was in that season that, honestly, I think I was reading through the book of Leviticus. And I remember exactly where I was in my room, sitting on my bed, roughly what time of day it was. And it basically came to the thought in my head, I either have to accept this book as the word of God, as different than every other book out there, or I got to throw this out altogether. There's not going to be any kind of take a little bit, leave a little bit, or I'm not going to have any idea how to know what's true and what's not. And that's when really I came to faith. And the way that happened is by basically accepting the Bible as the ultimate source of truth more than any pastor, more than any teacher. And that's been my kind of frame of reference since then. Obviously, relationship with Jesus and everything since then. College is where I'd say my faith really accelerated. I was part of Crew campus ministry, and that was very impactful, made a lot of very solid Christian friendships. And then I think some of episode 1 or 2 starts to pick up around there with some of the finish line story. I went into medicine, which is what I do now. And it was through that process of going through med school and living on very little, but my wife and I realizing that we were very content even with little, and knowing that we had just in the medicine track had some kind of predetermined income jumps along the way that were going to be sizable, and wanting to navigate that wisely. And that's what ultimately led us to a finish line. We didn't know it by that name, but it changed everything in our lives. And now we're, very much on the other side of that. And I would do it exactly the same again. And I'll let Cody share his story, and then I'll get back to the aspiring to the median, because that's an interesting historical reference.
Yeah, it's interesting. Although we grew up in the same home, and I always looked up to Kealan as a mentor in general, but especially as a spiritual mentor. I remember I was in 7th grade when he really started sharing his faith with me. And I was just excited to spend time with my older brother and not, getting chased around or smacked with something, like boys do. Yeah. So we would go for these long walks, and he would just tell me the things that he was thinking about, things that he was learning. And I would mostly listen. I had no idea what to say, but I listened to every word. It's interesting. As I got into high school, Kealan went off to college, and we didn't talk as much. And I kind of strayed a bit, I would say. I was spending time in church activities, but I was not really growing in my personal faith. And then I went off to college, and I fully went in on the Greek life thing. And that was where I spent most of my time and attention throughout college. And our dad actually every summer would invite me to go on like a church service project to go fix up homes. And I never took him up on it. And it was after I graduated, my dad said, "Hey, I know you don't want to do it, but I just thought I'd ask, do you want to come rebuild some homes with me?" And I said, "You know what? I'm going to be moving out of the house. I'll go with you." What he didn't tell me is because of my age at the time, I was considered an adult leader. And I was a leader to high school students who were attending the church that I grew up in. And I felt like such a fraud. And so I'm at this point in my life where I feel like I'm losing the community that I just poured into for 4 years in my fraternity. And at the same time, I'm getting exposed as a fraud, as an adult leader at a church youth camp. And I have no idea how to answer the questions that these high schoolers are asking me. And I don't know scripture. I had no idea what to say. And I got back from that experience, and I realized just in a moment, I know how to solve this big hole in my heart. And I called Kealan and I said, "Hey, I'm moving to Baltimore. How do I find a church? I don't even know where to start." And he plugged me in at a church. My wife and I dated all the way from high school up through college, and we're still dating at the time. And she started to come into church with me. And we both took ownership over our faith and really got to know Jesus personally during that time. And I was getting started in my career, working as a financial advisor, learning a ton about money, really, really fascinated about all the different tools of financial planning. But I was really focused on how to use money to build my own kingdom. And so it was over the course of several years, Kealan's going through this experience of really leaning into generosity and growing in his faith several years ahead of me at this point. And I'm just starting to read scripture for the first time, and it's starting to change the way that I see things. And so through a series of steps and conversations, I began tithing. That was a big step for me because I thought I could invest and be generous later. Kealan challenged that assumption, and I decided to start tithing. That was a big pivotal moment in my kind of money experience. But things really picked up when Kealan called me one night excitedly early 2020, and he said, "Hey, I want to talk to you about this idea that I have. It's called aspiring to the median." Did you ever read Crazy Love by Francis Chan? So I'll kick it back to Kealan to explain what happened next.
Yeah. So Crazy Love is a big part of I read that towards the end of college, had a big impact on my faith, Francis Chan. And in the middle of there, if you read it, you'll find it somewhere. Probably find a page reference somewhere. But he's just talking about what does an applied faith look like, basically. What does faith look like played out in your life? And he's just talking about theoretical scenarios. And he says, maybe somebody creates a movement called Aspiring to the Median, where people aspire to live at the U.S. median. And that was it. And it was on to the next theoretical thing. And this is all within, 2 or 3 years of my wife and I setting a finish line. And that's pretty similar to kind of how we set our own finish line. And I was like, oh my gosh, it was my first context of ever hearing anybody else say anything that remotely sounded like that. And obviously since then we've heard many, many stories like that. But so we actually reached out to the Crazy Love team and we're like, hey, we can't find anything about aspiring to the median. So we're assuming that this is not something that already exists, but this really resonates with us. We want to make it a real thing. And so our very first website was Aspiring to the Median. And, in our earliest episodes, you can hear little references to Aspiring to the Median in there. But that eventually evolved into the Finish Line Pledge, which I think more correctly embodies really the range and diversity of expression that we really think of in a finish line, which is a little bit more prescriptive of aspiring to the median. And I think Finish Line Pledge better captures what we are aiming for, even at the beginning. But it's a funny reference, and I'm impressed that you caught that.
Yeah, I actually love that line. So Todd, I'm going to turn it over to you to ask a couple of questions.
Yeah. So guys, remind the listeners, all of us, what year did the Finish Line Pledge start?
It started right in the beginning of COVID. So I was in residency at that time. We were looking 80 hours a week or something. And then suddenly that dropped to 30 hours a week when they sent us all out of the hospital. We were doing every 3 weeks, we would go in for nonstop handling stuff in the hospital. It was the most acute phase of COVID in the beginning days. And then they'd send us home for 2 weeks because they didn't want us all getting sick at once and then lose a whole department. So they were running us on shifts like that. And so when we were at home, you're an hour of remote stuff and then you're pretty free. So we had a sudden huge burst of time. So that's when we kind of launched everything off.
Yeah, I think Kealan built the website in February 2020 and the podcast showed up by the end of that year.
So we're a little over 4 years in, right?
Yep.
I'm curious, what are some of the things that have changed in your lives since you first started this journey?
Yeah, sure. So life looks a lot different for me now. First, we're not in the most acute phase of COVID. That's a big improvement. When we started, I think I had 3 daughters. I've had one more since then. We're up to 4, ages 3 through 8. So we have a loud home, but a lot of fun. I was also living in Philadelphia at the time. I've since moved to Maryland, graduated, finished residency, and then moved to Maryland for a job in private practice. And then have also since then become a partner in my practice. So I'm kind of on to steady state, long-term, It's funny, in medicine, there's all these steps, and then suddenly it's just steady state for decades. So kind of reached the end of that staircase. And there's been those income jumps that we knew were coming. And honestly, they were very easy to navigate. We had a finish line for years in place by that time, and our household income went up by multiples at each of those jumps, and our lifestyle really hasn't changed. It was really easy decision because we had made the decision so long before. But yeah, those are probably the biggest things that have changed life-wise.
How about you, Cody?
Yeah, on my end, when we set our first financial finish line back in 2020, my wife and I talked about it for quite some time, and we agreed with each other that it would be a finish line in the future. It was actually more than we were earning at the time. She was in graduate school. I was still early in my career, and we agreed we don't have kind of enough to support the lifestyle that we want to live right now. We were living in a small apartment. I think we were looking at buying our first house, and we felt really strapped. We were stressed out all the time about money, and we were not living generously. If you looked at our tax returns, if you looked at our bank statements, I seriously doubt I had ever given $1,000 in a year before then. So this was a really big shift for me to say, I felt like I was making a huge sacrifice for my future self at this time. What changed was there was overnight change. And the best analogy I have for it was it kind of felt like I was walking up a staircase that I could not see the end of it. It just goes up into the clouds and continues on past then. But what happened when I set a financial finish line is suddenly I could see the top of the staircase, and I realized I was most of the way up it in terms of income over the course of my career. And it gave me such a deep, profound sense of relief and contentment. It was like, we're almost there, even though we don't have enough right now.
Right.
And so that allowed us to kind of more aggressively think about how we're going to attack debt so that we can be more generous. So we hadn't even gotten to the good part, which is, actually expressing the generosity. So since then, we have gotten to taste generosity in a more full way, which God has used to invite us into a community. He's used generosity to really broaden our perspectives and to introduce me to the Great Commission. That was not a term that I was familiar with. It was not something that I was talking about. And that changed everything about my life. Just seeking to understand the Great Commission and how generosity plays a role in that. And the body of Christ works together as one body. So that perspective change happened suddenly and then just continued from that point forward.
That's so cool. Tell me how your giving, your personal giving, has morphed in this season. That kind of over the last 4 years.
Yeah. So early on in the journey, even really before we set a finish line, God placed empowering Native missionaries who are reaching their own people in, relatively unreached regions around the world. That was something my wife and I were passionate about and had really stepped into even before med school. That has evolved really through all the people that we've gotten to meet and talk to on the podcast. At this stage, I'd say kind of what our giving looks like. Our short game that we're playing is in Bible translation. So, we've talked a lot about Bible translation on the podcast. We had the opportunity to go to Illuminations last year, which was incredible, as all of the Bible translation agencies collaborating together to try to have translations available in every known human language by 2033, which is really soon. So that's why that's our short game. We want to see that momentum increase. We want to see that goal reached because that is a massive milestone for the Great Commission, having the Word of God available in every language. Our long game is still in Native missionaries and church planting around the world. And so even when the Bible is available to every language, it still needs to get to the people. There still needs to be churches planted and, continued movement. And we still support that, to a consistent level. But one of the, it's much longer conversation, but we have a whole kind of separate side. Well, it's not really a side ministry anymore, but a whole separate thing outside of the finish line that we launched just a little bit after the finish line. And that's called Compound Impact. And the very short explanation of that is we are, along with many other givers now, are buying residential properties and renting them to refugees who really struggle to find places to rent when they arrive here. They don't have any history or social security, no anything. So we rent them to refugee families. And then any of the proceeds from those homes go to fuel church planting and Great Commission kind of work around the world. And it has been really fun to see God work through that ministry. It's really getting a lot of momentum now. And we're seeing, people just coming alongside us. We don't actually talk about it a lot on the podcast or, in here because we want people working wherever they're supposed to be working. But that's something that God has really placed on our heart. And so that's our long game, is to see the Great Commission finished.
So if somebody wanted to learn more about Compound Impact, where would they go to learn about that?
We have a website, compoundimpact.org. It's a 501c3 nonprofit ministry, and all of the money that comes in from givers anywhere goes directly to launching these homes. So we're starting to pick up the pace on homes getting launched, which is pretty fun to watch.
That's fantastic. And Cody, I love your story. I'm going to do another shameless plug for the Finish Line Sprints, because you basically describe the cycle of fulfillment in your story, from peace to joy to purpose. And it's almost as if you wrote the Finish Line Sprint, or it came from a personal experience that you had. Yeah. So give us an update on the Finish Line Pledge. What do you see things going on right now?
Yeah, there's a lot that we've learned. So rebranding it felt like a really big thing, although we probably had, 10 people, including our parents, listening to the podcast at the time. We really wanted to get that right. We wanted to accurately describe what it is that we were trying to invite people into. So we spent a lot of time. We read the book Story Brand, and we went through that exercise of trying to understand, what is the core message? Why would someone be interested in doing something like this? Who is it for? So working through a lot of those things. And then also with that, the strategy has changed a little bit. So it used to be a big button on the website that says, take the pledge, and you click the button and you put in your finish line, and that's it. And we don't know who it was. We don't really have any details unless they provide it. Now it's much more relational. We've learned over and over and over and over and over that this is about people and their hearts. Money's involved, but at the core, it's about people. So what we've done instead is kind of lowered the barrier. And we took exactly how Kealan's conversation with me went back in 2020 and extended the same invitation in the same way. Try it out for 90 days, see for yourself, take that step of faith. And if it's not for you, we're not going to come knocking on your door. It's really for you. We want this perspective for you. So it's the 90-day pledge. We've lessened the focus on getting the finish line number exactly correct, because your brain kicks in and you go into analysis mode. So taking that step, it's getting the right number is less important than picking a number. So we have designed a lot of kind of content to share stories of how other people have set finish lines. There's emails that go out weekly for anyone who's interested in that kind of a thing. But one of the things that's been my favorite that we've added is coaching, because we realized that a lot of people might have interest in something like a financial finish line, but they don't know how it would work for them. So we actually have finish line guides. You can click and sign up, and a guide will reach out to you and just kind of talk through your situation, hear your story, maybe share their own story and say, this is, some ways that you might think about getting started. And then the emails to kind of encourage you along that 90 days. So that's been really, really exciting. We've had some really fun opportunities, like Kealan mentioned, to share with small and large audiences about just the concept. We're learning that within certain circles, it's well known. Within others, it's completely unknown. So just to be able to join the chorus of voices saying, hey, there's some benefit to having a structure and a plan and a strategy around your giving.
That's super. So now I'm going to ask you a question that I think is borderline impossible to answer. And I think I'm going to have to ask this question, and both of you answer this question, just to spread the wealth around, so to speak. So what are the three most memorable moments on the podcast. So I'm looking for 6 total moments because there are 2 of you.
Sure, I can start. And just for reference, Cody and I didn't share any of our answers before this because we wanted it to be a surprise what each other picked. So I'll share one here and I'll let Cody go and we can go back and forth. One of the ones that stands out really strong from the pretty early on was episode 20. That was David Johnson from Doulos Partners. I remember the moment that he said, there is a very real scenario where the Great Commission could be finished in our lifetime. Or actually, I think the way he said it is maybe not my lifetime, but maybe your lifetime. And when we finished that episode and then said goodbye and everything, Cody and I just stared at each other for like a good 10 minutes, just wrapping our heads around that. You know, now that feels more like commonplace knowledge because we have heard that reiterated and expanded upon with concrete plans and data and all this stuff from so many people since then. But that set off something in motion in my head personally that really, in a real way, permanently changed the trajectory of what I'm focused on and thinking about.
Yeah, for me, it was really early on. A guy named John Cortines reached out to us. And it might have been one of the first people to ever send us an email to, I think it was probably info@aspiringtothemedian.com. And Kealan forwarded it over to me. And it was such an encouragement. And he wrote this email to say, hey, I just occasionally type in finish lines into Google just to keep tabs on what's going on out in the world. And I found you guys and I just wanted to connect and see who you are and what you're thinking about. And we got to chat with him. And it was so much work back then because we didn't know what we were talking about. And we didn't know what to do next. And we didn't know why we were doing any of it. We just felt like we were supposed to. And we were recording podcast episodes as a supplement to the Sprint program. So we created scripts, we practiced them, we edited them ourselves, which we were terrible at using GarageBand. And it was so much work and it was really stressful. And so we said, John, will you come be on our podcast? And he said, yeah, I'd love to. And he was one of our first guests that we interviewed. And we said, oh my gosh, that was so much easier and so much fun. That is the only kind of episode we want to do from now on. So that was a huge shift. But honestly, I don't know if we'd still be doing it today if we hadn't learned that lesson early on.
I was laughing hearing him talk about those first couple of episodes. And it was a ton of work back then. Anybody who's started a podcast, you know, there's a lot of resources out there, but it's still a learning curve. I think the first 2 episodes, we literally labeled them uneditable. It was like, they're so bad. We're like, all right, just scratch, start over again from the beginning. So yeah, that's going back a little ways now. So number 2 for me is actually kind of related to the one Cody just shared. Another early guest, Tim Barker from ROI Ministry. So it was cool how we got connected to Tim. Most of our connections now are just word of mouth. You know, community knows each other, you know, and so people, you know, pass us on to other people who are thinking along the same lines. But back in those days, like Cody said, we didn't know a single person in the generosity community. And so we got connected to Tim because we built this finish line calculator, which still exists on our website and it is a cool resource. One of the parts of that calculator is it says, hey, if you set this finish line based on your current income, you'll free up roughly X amount per year to give. And then we turned around and took data from the ROI Ministry website and said, hey, if you have $7,000 to give by setting a finish line, that translates roughly to X number of people that could be reached with the gospel, X number of people that could have clean water that are otherwise dying of preventable diseases, you know, a bunch of different iterations of that. That's all from there. And so I reached out to them early on. I was like, hey, you know, we're just pulling stuff from your website. Just wanted to like make sure that's okay. And we're all in the clear. And he turned right around and called me and was like, hey, what are you guys doing here? Like, this is awesome. And has been a long-term friend since then. We've both, you know, supported each other in many ways. But one of the things that Tim did early on, they make a top 10 list every year of the top 10 most per dollar, most impactful ministries. And so he said, hey, why don't I connect you to some of the ministries that we work with, and you can share some of their stories. And so that helped us to we had started in the generosity sphere alone, but that really bridged the gap to seeing what's on the forefront. What is God doing? And how can people who are trying to figure out how to steward their resources step into that? How can we kind of bridge that connection? And that really kind of permanently changed the trajectory. We've had many ministry guests since then, and really some pretty amazing stories of the work that's being done out there and where God's on the move.
My second moment involves what we have come to refer to as the lost episode. This was December of 2023, so about 6 months ago from today, and we got a chance to interview Jimmy Seibert, and we had such a fun interview with him. He was wearing AirPods, and they died about 12 minutes into the episode, and he said, give me a second, I've got to go use a different pair of AirPods, and he swapped them out. We're using a relatively new software that we weren't well practiced with, and we recorded the rest of the interview, which was another 45 minutes or so, and we had so much fun, and it was really, really great interview. And he logs off, and I go to check the recordings, and his stops at 12 minutes. And my heart sank. You can imagine the amount of work that goes into one episode, but also that was a moment. Like, we just spent a couple hours together and had such a fun conversation, and nobody else is going to have the benefit of being able to listen to that, be encouraged by it. And it ruined my week. I was really down about that. That really bothered me. But a couple weeks ago, this was such a God thing. I just happened to be reading through like the frequently asked questions on the homepage of the software that we use for recording. And I was clicking down the carrots, and I'm reading all this fine detail. And it said something about backup cloud recordings. And I couldn't find where to find them. And I finally, through about 10 minutes of Googling, figured out that our software backed up all the audio in the cloud. And I had no idea before then. So I clicked this magic button, and the episode reappeared 4 months after it had disappeared. And I called Kealan, and I said, you're never going to believe it. And it was just such a relief, but so exciting that we were just able to recover that episode. And, you know, all that work was not wasted. It was one of my highlights of the podcast, really. It was that exciting.
Have you aired the episode?
Love that.
It was this previous episode 99. So as we're recording today, it's actually not released yet, but by the time this is live, it'll have been the most recent episode. So yeah, I mean, it's gone for 4 months. And also in that time, you know, we just, from scheduling conflicts, we weren't able to reschedule him. He was super gracious about it. He's like, that's okay. Like, we'll figure it out. But we just happened to get delayed long enough that God just provided the episode back. It was our only lost episode, and now we're back to a perfect record. I think we did have to re-record like 15 minutes of Steve French back in the beginning. But other than that, we've had, I think, a perfect record of not losing an episode.
Well, you know, we went to college with Jimmy.
Right.
So David and I have been influenced deeply by his life and ministry and faith. So that's kind of fun that he'll be on the episode right before this one.
Such a fun episode. Like, man, so many stories coming out of his life and his church. And, you know, just to say again to what Cody was just talking about and losing an episode, you know, it seems like not a big deal. Like, it's just an hour, just re-record it. But, you know, we take very seriously the time that all of our guests give us, including both of you even being with us tonight. When we started this, we were literally just, you know, two guys. That was our credentials, and really had no business, you know, being able to talk to all the people that we've been able to talk to. And so we are always super gracious. And anybody who has been on the podcast who's listening right now, you know, it means so much that people are just open with their lives. We've had actually a number of people who have shared their stories for the first time on the podcast. They've come, and then we've asked them, and they say, you know, we don't share our story, but, you know, well, all right, we'll do it. So we take that very seriously. And the idea of losing an episode is like our worst nightmare. So I'll go to number 3. This is a little more on the humorous side. So this is our longest answer to a question. And this goes back to episode 36 with Morgan Jackson from Faith Comes by Hearing. What an amazing storyteller. Like anybody who's heard Morgan Jackson talk, he has stories for days that would blow your mind. He permanently changed my understanding of Bible presentation and how people interact with the Bible, how communities interact with the Bible, and just incredible to hear him, share the stories of what's going on in their ministry and his life. But the first question, we start everybody off with a pretty broad question. Tell us a little bit about yourself. And that's what we gave him. And it was an hour and 15 minutes before we got to the next question. So, to be fair, we had given him some of our questions ahead of time. So he knew a little bit about where we were going. But, he got talking about, his life, which is pretty connected to his family. And then the launch of Faith Comes by Hearing and all the stuff that God has done through that ministry since then. And it was an hour and 15 minutes before we got to the next question.
Yeah. How many more questions did you ask?
Another 2 questions. They were a little shorter.
Yeah.
But, neither of us wanted to jump in. We're like, we can't stop this. This is amazing. So there it is. Technically our fewest questions on any interview.
That's fantastic.
My last favorite moment, Kealan was actually still living in Philadelphia at the time, and I happened to be visiting. This was probably 2021, late 2021, and Matt Letourneau from Never Thirst was one of the first of the ROI top 10 ministries that we invited, and he had no idea who we were, I imagine, and we had this amazing interview. It was so much fun. And we put it out, and I think Tim Barker may have reshared it to his network. And that really opened us up to kind of really getting into the weeds of the finances with leaders of nonprofits and charities. But on this weekend, Matt reached out and said, "Hey, I'm going to be in Philly visiting with donors. Could I meet with you guys?" And we could not imagine what he might want to meet about. So he actually took us to dinner not far from where Kealan was living at the time. And we went and sat down with him. And he said something that I was not expecting at all. He said, "Hey, do you guys know anybody in Ohio, out in that part of the country?" And we said, "Not really. Who are you talking about?" And he said, "Someone started, engaging with Never Thirst and said that they found out about Never Thirst from the Finish Line podcast." And we said, "Oh, that's pretty cool." And then he shared what that interaction was like. And it was pretty significant. It was a substantial relationship that they've built together to kind of tackle this clean water and spiritual poverty need globally. And we just had never really thought through the possibility that God might use something like an interview that we're conducting from our basements to connect 2 people that we didn't know a year before and move mountains. Like, it's just astounding. And so it started to happen more frequently. And Matt said, "Hey, we actually added a how did you find out about us button that says Finish Line Podcast because enough people are coming through." And we just thought God's up to something that we didn't even notice. We had no idea. It really humbled me and helped me understand, even though it's a lot to ask of our guests and our wives to say, "Hey, can we carve out this time once a week, once every other week, and do the editing and all that kind of stuff?" It is such an honor to be able to just do this. And we hope to be able to do this for a really long time.
You're certainly strengthening
awesome,
an incredible community. And it is amazing how an environment like this really is a relational thing. And it's just extraordinary. We're all grateful.
Yeah. And broadening a community, right?
Yes.
Which is a really cool aspect of the work. So how has your understanding of generosity evolved or changed, shifted since starting this endeavor together?
Yeah, so many ways. We have been very broadened from where we started at on those first couple self-recorded episodes. The broad answer I would give is that I appreciate so much more now the true breadth and diversity of expressions of generosity. And actually, a couple months ago, I came across a verse that perfectly summed up kind of what I have been just noting and thinking about. So that's 1 Corinthians 12:6 says there's different kinds of working, but in all of them and in everyone, it's the same God at work. And, if you think all the way back to those aspiring to the median days, whereas like pretty much like a one dimension kind of, ask or whatever you want to say, to now with, these 100 episodes of givers across all different spectrums, all different realms of business and missions and different things that's going on. So just a couple kind of contrasts that I've picked out as we've spent a lot of time in the last couple months really going back through all this content and trying to pull out themes, trying to pull out patterns of how generosity works. And Cody mentioned our emails list. We send out an email every week. That's kind of some of what these themes, frameworks, patterns that we're seeing across many givers at this point. So a couple of just cool kind of frameworks. There's people who are really focused on their local community. I think back of the Amigos on episode 22, just pouring themselves into the foster care community in Orlando. And through their giving, through their time, through their family, which is a large family now, as you might expect, somebody involved in foster care. My wife and I are foster parents too, so we really resonated with them. And then you look at people focused globally, and we've talked to many givers on that front too. And I think of Richard Baxter, who's back on episode 23, a dentist who's channeled his whole office into fueling unreached people groups. So it's like all over their office, all over everything they do. And he's got some amazing stories globally working. I think about spontaneous generosity versus planned generosity. On the spontaneous side, there's a couple good ones. Jimmy Seibert's actually has some great spontaneous stories. I think also of Matthew Henley back on episode 69. Just some really cool stories of just like, hey, I saw a need and I just jumped in. Like, I didn't think about it for more than 10 seconds. I just jumped in it to see what God has done through. Like, he was rattling off stories like that, over and over. And then on the other hand, I think of Aaron and Miran Cho back on one of the earlier episodes also, who take 2 full days every year to just sit in prayer individually about how God's leading them, both in how much to give and how and where to give, in just a super intentional, spirit-led, planned way each year. And so I think about anonymous generosity versus not anonymous, kind of more inspirational generosity. I think of Andy DeWitt back on episode 54. He actually straddled both sides and kind of shares how God changed his perspective. He used to be all anonymous and don't let the left hand know what the right hand's doing. There's obviously a lot of biblical framework for that. But then he shares about what changed his mind into being more open about his story and his generosity and how God uses that to fuel others, inspiring them to generosity. And so it was just cool to see that transition in his story. We had Randy Alcorn on not too long ago, and we just threw that question at him like face on, what is it? Let your light shine before all men, or don't let your right hand know what the left hand is doing. And, he knocked that one out of the park, obviously. So that's cool. Then I think another one, we talked about high ROI giving. There's a huge community around, how much impact can you have per dollar? And that, I think is a super important concept and a lot of resources now around that. But then on the other side, there's also givers who are tackling really difficult problems. And those problems are never going to be the lowest hanging fruit or the cheapest. I think of Doug Cobb and the Finishing Fund just trying to tackle every single people group that doesn't have a single believer. That is not cheap to do. That's an expensive believer to make, but an extremely powerful and critical one. And so, or you look at Illuminations and the Bible translation movement with these enormous goals, that takes a lot of fuel, but God is moving in incredible ways. So, just seeing the diversity and dynamics. And at this point, I don't ever say for myself or for anybody else, this is how generosity has to be expressed, or this is how God intends it, or that, or whatever. There is too much range of expression that God gives us for anybody to say it has to be this way. And obviously, we're huge fans of a finish line. And I would encourage anybody to explore a finish line. But I wouldn't even say that everybody should have a finish line, because I think there's just, God is going to work in whatever way that he's going to work. So that's what really God has changed the most in my head in the last 100 episodes.
Cody, do you have anything that you'd want to elaborate Kealan's answer?
Yeah, I've learned that giving is a lot of fun and it's a relational thing. As a financial planner, as someone who was not giving or living generously, it seemed like a transactional thing. It seemed like something that I could spreadsheet and project and make some assumptions about. And I'm starting to understand that it's far more complex than that and far more joy creating than that for everyone involved, really. Generosity doesn't really upset a lot of people, like my example is with my wife. We spent a lot of time since setting a finish line talking about how do you like to express generosity? And I like to have a plan. I like to have a goal. I like to achieve or exceed a goal. And she likes to respond to a need that she's aware of. That might be right in front of her. It might be someone she heard about. It might be a total stranger. So one of the first things that we did that was so much fun is she became aware of someone through Facebook that I think she had met one time that actually got a cancer diagnosis. And Steph said, I want to help. I don't know what to do. What do we have? How can we help? And I said, I have no idea. I'm not good at this kind of stuff. But my wife is an expert. And so she went through this woman's social media and discovered that she loved a certain type of crafting and that she had actually posted a month before that it was like her wish list item was, I forget if it was sewing or some kind of crafting. And it was like a $25 item. And we had to look at our bank account to see if we had that much in the bank, and she bought it online and we went and she dropped it off on the doorstep and did the ding dong ditch thing. She rang the doorbell and ran and she jumped in the car and she looked through the window and got to see this woman, pick it up and look around. What is going on? And then when we got home, we went on Facebook and that woman had posted this incredible post. And whoever it is out there, thank you so much. This made my whole day. I've been going through a really hard time. And it was like, oh my gosh, I might have missed the whole point here. So I'm learning that generosity and giving are not the same thing. Giving is an expression of generosity. But when done in community, when done as a relational thing, there's nothing better. And it's become my favorite use of money. We've heard so many times from Ron Blue and Kingdom Advisors about the uses of money, but I don't know. It's hard to beat giving. It's just so fun. How do you put a value on the joy that's created? John Cortines, I think, talked about spending versus giving. It's like that spending provides that roller coaster thrill that when you buy something, right, that utility of that purchase starts to decline as soon as you get off that roller coaster. But giving, it sparks, stuff you could never dream up in your wildest imagination.
So that reminds me, Cody, of one of my favorite passages that I recently was introduced to in the Message, which is Proverbs 11:24. But the way Eugene Peterson translates that is just what you were describing to me, which is the world of the generous gets larger and larger. The world of the stingy gets smaller and smaller. And that's what you're describing, right? Is how giving and generosity expands your relational world and brings blessing. Very cool. Let me ask you another question. How have you seen God work through the podcast? Give us another story or two that has kind of energized and motivated you guys to keep doing this hard work.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy on the motivation front. We say all the time that even if we didn't have a single listener, we would continue on indefinitely just because of how much it has fueled us personally, spiritually, relationally. I mean, our lives are so different now because of the podcast over these last couple of years. And so that's easy. Although we're glad that other people listen too. So if you're listening, we appreciate you. We've shared a couple ways that we've seen God work. Getting that episode back is one of the most surprising ways that he worked. I think on the encouraging side is we've heard many stories now from ministries that have been on the podcast about how givers have been connected to ministries, how collaborations have happened, how, people have been connected in ways just because of this common medium of a podcast, basically people coming all together to one place, which is the same anywhere that you get a bunch of like-minded people together. That kind of concept I've started to call spiritual templating. And I think it is actually really important, really for any area of faith, but also especially in generosity, is having people's lives to see and look at and see how God has worked in their lives and being able to grow and apply that in your own life. And that's been obviously huge for the two of us. Like, I think back to those early days of where God was moving in our lives in generosity, but we didn't have all these other people to see from. And so now, knowing how powerful that is, I would never do it any other way. I just want constant stories and relationships to help me grow as a believer, not just in generosity. I mean, we've grown in so many other areas of prayer and community and other areas that are all interrelated to generosity. And so I think that's been one of the biggest ways that I've seen God work, is in this kind of idea of spiritual templating.
Yeah, for me, it's really around this concept of community. Kealan is extremely humble and hesitant to talk about his own story. I think it was a big step to be willing to share his own story early on in the podcast, but I can't imagine how kind of alone he must have felt early on when he first set a financial finish line without knowing that that was an established concept. And then just doing that for years. And even when he talked to me about it, I got a little nervous. Like, don't tell me that this is for me too. Like, I don't want to hear it. I'm not interested. I'm not buying what you're selling. And that's how it can feel. There's a lot of similarities to kind of when you're early in your faith and you feel called to share your faith and you don't really know how to do it. It feels risky. I think when you are, at least what I gather from several people that we've talked to after an actual interview, they said, hey, I felt really good to kind of share my story, but I felt really alone. This has been a really isolating experience, and we're committed to it, and God provides, and we wouldn't trade it for the world, but I just don't know anybody that I can even talk to about this. And to be able to say, hey, can we give you the emails of a couple people who you should really, you're just like them. You're going to get along really well. Let me connect you with generous giving. You should reach out to your local NCF office. And to be able to connect people through this medium has been my favorite part of it, for sure.
So I'm going to press in a little bit on the spiritual template thing, just a little bit more. I'm very intrigued by that. So go a little bit deeper with that. Cody, earlier you mentioned a framework, but some strategies or frameworks that you've heard over the years that might help us process the spiritual template thing a little bit more.
Yeah, well, the way that I think about it, I thought that I already was a generous person before we started the podcast. I thought I had figured that part out and I could move other things. Now, I liked talking about it. I liked finding other people who also kind of thought along the same lines, but I didn't know that there was more to grow. And, God has flipped up and turned around and all kinds of stuff so many different ways since that time. But I think if I didn't have these other people to kind of build off of and see, God, you're talking to all these people who have spent decades of, time with God, time in the Word, and God showing them through their business or their family or their kids or the ministry they're involved in or whatever. God revealed this one area of how giving can be, powerful or generous, or how to think about it. And then by them sharing our story in 30 minutes, 60 minutes, then suddenly that lifelong lesson is immediately available to us. And Cody and I talk probably almost every day about something or another, podcast related or something else. And there's so many stories. Like people don't realize they share their story here with us and they think, oh, I'm done with the interview. Cody and I are like talking about all that stuff and we're like, oh man, how do we apply this in our lives? And so I think in every area of faith, but generosity included, it's important to surround yourself by people whose lives you can mirror off of and learn from what God is doing in their lives. And it's so much easier to do now than it was 100 years ago. You can look up a podcast or a conference or whatever about almost any small niche topic that you want. So you can find, all the people who are talking about prayer and sharing about how that looks in their life, or people who are talking about giving in as a group or in community, or people who are talking about impact investing or whatever. You can find the people who are talking about it. And so I think that's, makes a huge difference in your growth.
Well, let me just tell you, you two are a blessing. For those of us that have been in the generosity movement, frankly, those of us that are getting old or older, we thank God for the two of you. And many of the others that you mentioned that are younger and are taking this generosity movement places that we've never imagined. The generosity movement is in good hands. It's been an honor to be with you. Now, there are a couple of more questions, though, that are required because you require them. So here's one, and then I'll let Todd close with another. So what are the next 5 to 10 years? What are you most excited about? And you definitely should be able to get this question right. You've asked it so many other times. So.
Yeah, we've learned that that's one of the most fun questions to ask. And I think for me personally, it's probably starting a family. That's something that my wife and I are very excited about over the next 5 to 10 years. And we've spent so much time with Kealan and his family. And it's such an honor to be able to do this with my brother. And so it's deepened my understanding of the value of family. There's like an inherent trust behind all of this to be able to kind of work on finish line and compound impact together. But it's just the most fun thing that I've ever gotten to do. So I'm really excited about the different perspectives that I'm becoming aware of. And like you said, from people my age or younger, I'm becoming aware of people who are in college, right out of college, who are challenging my perspectives on things. And I feel like I'm pretty new. I'm like the new kid in school still. And there's people who are 18, 21, who are speaking boldly about things that I wish I knew when I was their age. So that is incredibly exciting to have this link from, we can look back in scripture for thousands of years and link all the way up into the future. And to see all of these things working together, it really doesn't feel like a coincidence that we see a generosity movement and then we see massive acceleration in technology. I don't know what role AI plays yet, but God does. I see collaboration that I've never seen in the business world. I see movements of people trying to understand how to leverage everything that they've been given, their business, their family, their time, everything that they have surrendered to the Lord for his purposes and working together as a team, as a body. I don't know where that leads, but I sometimes sit awake at night just dreaming about, how can I be more a part of this? Like, what else is there in life? So that's where I get just really fired up thinking about the next 5 to 10 years.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I would definitely echo seeing globally what God is doing. I mean, when somebody would say the Great Commission, even just a couple of years ago, I'd be like, oh yeah, that's the thing from 2,000 years ago. That's for 2,000 years from now. And I mean, we've had too many conversations at this point to think that's a coincidence. God is doing something in this point in history that is different than every other point in the last 2,000 years. And whether it's our generation or my kids, like it's not far away that there's going to be some very significant milestones getting checked off. You look at Doug Cobb and the Finishing Fund, they are into single digits of people groups that are left out of 7,000 people groups or more, depending on how you count them. And then, there is just a small handful left that don't have a single believer. You look at the Bible translation world, they're trying to and making major progress every year towards having a translation in every language by 2033. That's like very soon. And then you look at the church planting world and you get all these ministries that have been working for decades independently, now all at once sharing huge volumes of basically top secret information that's highly sensitive about the location of every missionary, every church on the globe, basically creating the master plan towards, what's left of the Great Commission. When you start seeing stuff like that happening, it's inevitable that that is going to be accomplished. On top of that, the great wealth transfer, trillions of dollars moving hands among Christians in like the next 10 years. And then, as you guys are well aware, the explosion of the generosity movement over the last 20 years or so, that is only picking up speed and branching in all kinds of ways. So it is not a coincidence that all that's happening at once. So, every year is interesting now at this point. It's like we're not counting in decades, we're counting in years to see the progress that God's going to make each year. That's, I think, what I'm most excited about.
Fantastic.
I love it. These are extraordinary times, and great summary and vision for what God's called you guys to. And I think one of the greatest joys of my life, it's kind of fun to be doing this with David, because we've been locking arms for almost 40 years in ministry and life. So you guys getting to do that together and the communities that God's building, it's really, really cool and a great joy. So I know that you typically end every episode with kind of one practical action that listeners can take to step into their roles more fully as stewards. So what suggestion do each of you have? One kind of simple, practical action that any of us could take?
Yeah, sure. Well, mine's easy on some of the theme from tonight. I would say for anyone listening, find spiritual templates to start to build into your life. And I don't just mean listen to this podcast. Obviously, you're already listening to this podcast, or at least this episode, but find them anywhere. There are many really good podcasts out there. There's ones in the business world, Faith-Driven Investor, Faith-Driven Entrepreneur, Generosity Now podcast. There's several good generosity ones out there. So, in the giving business as mission world, there's a ton of stuff. There's conferences. I highly recommend anybody in the generosity world to make their way to a celebration conference, Generous Giving, and just to hear the stories coming out of there, to stories from just the people at your own table, or to do a journey of generosity locally, either host one or join one with Generous Giving. So much community and templating available through Generous Giving and the foundation that's been built there. Or, with some other kind of meetup, but find some way to just hear what God is doing in others' lives, because that's where so much growth is to be found.
Yeah, the thing I'd share, occasionally I'll get feedback. I even heard it this week. Someone said, I've listened to a bunch of episodes of the podcast and I just don't have millions of dollars to give away. So I don't really know what to do with that.
Yeah.
I don't either. I may never. That's okay with me. That really doesn't have that much to do with generosity. My suggestion, this whole idea of creating the Finish Line Pledge and the podcast and the sprints, it was out of a desire to invite others into what God was doing in us. And so my manager's minute is to find a way, even if you feel like you don't have enough, even if you feel like you're not doing a lot, find a way to invite somebody else into what God's doing in your heart today. You never know where that might lead.
And I think we got to turn it back around on you guys also. I know you've each already have shared at least one manager's minute in the last several years with us, but we can't let you out without at least one more.
Well, since Kealan did a dozen different suggestions in his answer to the question. I'll keep mine really short. Yeah, you brought up Randy Alcorn earlier, and y'all did a podcast with him. And in some ways, he's kind of one of the elder statesmen in the generosity movement. We really are all in his wake in many ways. And he wrote a little book that had a theme that said, you can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. So my encouragement is to people that are listening, don't wait to give. Nobody regrets, at least in my experience, stretching themselves to be more generous. So ask God to show you opportunities to be more generous, and then just obey. And it could be suggestions from what we've just been talking about, or it could just be like the story of Cody's wife, a spontaneous giving situation. Just step out in faith and really press into generosity. You won't regret it.
So following on David's comments, I would say, number one, I've never met a former giver. I think that's a very interesting reality. So test that one. People don't regret being generous, and people who are generous don't stop being generous. And kind of tying into the foundations or the starting of the Finish Line podcast and aspiring to the median, I would invite people to explore the prayer of Agur and see if you can find the prayer of Agur. I'll give you a hint. It's in Proverbs 30. And Agur prays, Lord, give me neither poverty nor riches, which I think is not the mentality of our culture in the U.S., even in the church. But I think this idea of give us enough, give us our daily bread, as Jesus taught us to pray, is such a powerful idea. And you guys are living testimonies of the power of answering the question, how much is enough, or establishing some kind of a finish line. And I agree with you, Kealan. It's not in the scriptures. I don't think it's a calling for every person's life, but everyone I know who has lived into this way of being in the world they don't regret it.
Well, we just want to thank you guys again for hosting us tonight, but also for the example that you guys have led. I mean, we were lucky enough to get Todd to join us back on episode 25. It took us all the way until 86 to get to David, but we got him in there too. And, your guys' names have come up so many times because of how much you have poured into people, how much your lives have touched other people. And you have been a massive foundation for us and all those who have come through and after you or worked beside you. So we're grateful for you guys and for the work that you continue to do. And it's just a privilege to be here tonight with you guys.
Honored to be with you all. Thank you.
Yeah, sure is. Honored. Cody, you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, if you're listening to this episode or if you've listened to any other episodes, thank you so much for taking the time. We know that these are really long episodes. We do that on purpose. We've gotten the feedback that they're long. We know, and we just want to create space to really dive into what God is doing all over the world. And we've got dozens of examples of that, but we also understand there's absolutely no shortage of incredible stories of what God's doing. So thank you for supporting and encouraging us by listening, by sharing. But our prayer for you, we pray pretty much before every episode that God would use this episode to do something that we couldn't imagine, that someone would be encouraged, someone would be challenged, someone would be cut to the heart thinking about, does scripture really say that? I have to go dive in,
Yeah.
That's my prayer for this episode and every episode before this and after this. That's really why we do it. It's so that God can use those hours that we put in, that all of our guests have put in, to do something that none of us could ever imagine or do on our own. So once again, Todd, David, thank you so much for being with us today. We've learned so much from you, and we're just incredibly grateful for your long obedience in the same direction.
Thanks for letting us flip the script. It's been fun.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the show, guys. If you want to find any of our references or links from today's show, you can always find them in our show notes at finishlinepledge.com/episode 100. Before we wrap up, we just wanted to take a minute to thank some of the people that have made these last 100 episodes possible. At the top of the list, we want to thank our many guests who have joined us here on the show. You've generously shared your time and stories to encourage others in their own journeys, and we have learned so much from you over these past few years. We also want to thank you guys, our listeners, for walking with us all this time. It's been so much fun being on this journey together. And a special shout out to the handful of you that have been with us since the very early days, occasionally sending encouragement along the way. You've made all this effort so worth it. We also want to thank our editing team that's been absolutely essential for us all along the way. And last but certainly not least, we want to thank our wives, Stephanie and Allison, who have given up many evenings to allow us to make this podcast possible. There's no one we'd rather walk beside through this journey of generosity. That's all we have for today. We'll see you next time.